I'm Corel Painter Master Aaron Rutten, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to use some of the custom brushes I created for Corel Painter in November of 2017. In November I created 5 brushes, so let's go ahead and take a look at how each of them work one by one. The first brush is a thick paint brush called Super Thick. It's in my thick paint palette. Here's some examples of the strokes, but I'll go ahead and show you how you can use it. I can simply make a brush stroke and it builds up very thick on itself. But if I have the Wacom Art Pen, which I can use to rotate the angle of the brush stroke, then I can get some more options. For example, over here, if I turn my pen at an angle, I can get these thin lines, whereas if I use it in the opposite direction, I get thicker strokes. So I can go between the two different kinds of strokes. I can make diagonal strokes, and it works really well. So you might find this useful for drawing things like water ripples, or maybe blades of grass. You might even find it useful for painting trees and tree trunks. I can just kind of scrub back and forth to build it up on itself to get that textured trunk, then use a smaller brush just to scrub in some other little branches here. I can also select a brownish color, and I can use little short strokes to put in little rocks and things like that, or I can use a bigger, broader brush to put in some water ripples like this. So that's the super thick brush. Let's move on to the next brush, which is also a thick paint brush. This one's called Thick Fractal. By the way, these thick paint brushes are only compatible with Corel Painter 2018 and later. When I use this brush, it creates a thick paint layer. Now I can get a variety of different looks with this brush depending on whether I press down lightly or very firm. But I can also control the texture that I get by changing the paper. So right now this is just such a basic paper. But if I change it to something like Pebble Board, and I increase the scale and contrast of the Pebble Board, you'll see that I get a different pattern here in my little blobs. If I change it to something like this contrasty random cracks, then you can see I get that cracked pattern when I paint. So it controls the texture of the paint. If I make my brush really big, I'm going to get really big, broad, cloudy areas. It might be a little bit slower though, so don't make it too big. If I use a smaller brush, then I'll get finer little patchy areas of texture. I could also use this to kind of glaze over areas. If I choose a lighter color, paint a little bit, and then set the composite method of that layer to something like multiply, then it's a little more transparent. I could also set the composite method of that layer to overlay, select a neutral gray, and then I could simply just paint with this as if it's a texture brush. In addition to Thick Fractal, there's also a brush called Thick Glazing. Kind of a similar brush, but it gives you a thinner, flatter, more wet-looking glaze. I'm going to choose a yellow-orange color to glaze with here, and I'll paint. And right now I'm getting kind of a more opaque glaze, but again I could change the composite method to multiply, then I get a more wet, transparent glaze. Now if I use light pressure, I get kind of a thin glaze. If I use firm pressure, I get a thicker glaze. If I use a bigger brush, that glazing area will be softer and broader. If I use a smaller brush, then it'll be tighter. You can also kind of blend and bleed colors together as well. I have this purple color that I can kind of start to mix into that glaze. And it's very much like using your finger to apply glaze with traditional media. The next brush that we'll look at is called Oily Bristles. That's in my rendering palette. Oily Bristles is also only compatible with Corel Painter 2018 and later. It's using the enhanced liquid mode. And so it's a nice liquidy brush, very oily, smudges around. It looks really nice the way it blends with other paint and kind of mixes things around. Could be very good for impressionist painting and things like that. I can also make dabs with it if I want to. And I can even use it on a separate layer while retaining transparency. So that means that it will be transparent and see-through. If I use a smaller brush, I get kind of more broken bristles. And if I use a larger brush, then I get more bristles densely packed together. But the brush is much slower. I'm going to blend in some color here, and you can see it also gives you very nice blending effects if you kind of scrub the paint together. And just use lighter pressure to have it kind of fade out and blend more. And the last brush that we'll look at is technically not a brush, it is an image hose nozzle. You can find that in my image hose and particles palette drawer, and it's in the nature category. Down at the bottom, it's called Far Trees Dead. Now in order to use an image hose nozzle, you also need an image hose brush, and that brush is suggested here in the bottom of the icon. It says to use linear size P, so we'll choose linear size P. We'll go ahead and create a new layer for my trees here. I'm going to make my brush the size of the trees that I want, and linear means it's going to come out in a linear fashion. Size P means I can control the size with the pressure, so if I use lighter pressure, I get smaller trees. If I use firmer pressure, I get bigger trees. Let's go ahead and hide those other layers so you can see exactly what I'm doing here. So I can paint these big trees in the foreground, and if I wanted to, I could create a layer beneath it, and put in smaller trees, and I get that nice distant forest effect. Now if I want to color those trees, I can do that a few different ways. One is I can go ahead and make a selection of that layer by right-clicking on it and choosing Select Layer Content. Hide the selection with Control-Shift-H. Create a new layer. I'll call that layer Tint. I'll set the composite method to multiply, and then I can choose a color that I want to tint my trees. Make sure I'm filling with current color, and then there you go. I have my trees that are tinted. Another way to do it, if I create a new layer, is to select linear size P color instead. And then if I click on my additional color, which is this background swatch here, I can choose a color. And then when I paint, my trees will be automatically tinted. Now I still have that selection active from earlier, so I actually need to deselect that. I'll hit Control D to do that. And now I can paint in my trees. Now they do lose a little bit of their depth or their three-dimensionality when you add color to them this way compared to when you do it the other way, but that gives you two different options. You might also experiment with some of the other types of image hose brushes because it'll spit out the trees in different ways, and you might be able to get some unexpected results that way too. So there you go, that's a demonstration of the 5 brushes I released for Corel Painter in November 2017. You can download these brushes on my website at aaronrutten.com. If you enjoyed this video, take a quick second to click the like button. And if you're new to my channel, I'd love to have you subscribe. I have a lot more videos for digital artists like you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.